Hello, and welcome to this webinar on the work domain of the University Mental Health Charter and the Library of Learning. We're going to spend a little bit of time in this session just kind of exploring some of the key issues in the work domain that may be helpful to think about in developing your whole university approach and thinking about the mental health of the university community in total. My name is Dr. Gareth Hughes, and it's my pleasure to be taking you through the next half hour or so. So the work domain includes two themes in the University Mental Health Charter: staff wellbeing and staff development. And those two things are intrinsically linked together, as we will see as we progress through all of this. We'll begin, however, by talking about staff wellbeing. Now, why is this important? Well, to start with, staff wellbeing is important in and of itself. Any genuine whole university approach really has to think about the mental health and wellbeing of its staff, because the mental health of the entire community includes those staff. So if we're going to be serious about the mental health of our community in total, we have to think about our staff body. And of course, our staff are just as entitled to good mental health and well-being as anyone else. It's also, of course, important to say that staff well-being is also important because it has direct impacts on student well-being. And there is more research developing over time, more being published. So I would particularly point to a paper published by a team of Kings that you can find in the references, which talks specifically to students about their observations about staff well-being and the impact that it has on them. And they're very clearly making that link between mental health and well-being of the academics, particularly who teach them, and how that then impacts on their mental health and well-being. So what do we know? What does the research tell us? And what are we hearing from our work on the University Mental Health Charter overall? Well, let's start with the fact that research and national reporting generally suggests that this is not a happy picture at the moment, and there are significant concerns about university staff well-being across the sector. There is some clear indications that university staff have caught high levels of stress and higher levels of burnout than the general population, and low levels of well-being in comparison to many other sectors, which is of concern for a number of reasons. We're also seeing, actually, at the higher end of that, significant numbers of university staff who appear to be experiencing difficulties with their mental health overall, high levels of clinical distress. And we're seeing increases in the number of staff who are attempting to access support through things like employee assistance programs or occupational health. And in some cases, this has also resulted in concern from statutory bodies who are actually invested in exploring what's happening in specific universities and whether staff wellbeing and health and safety is being sufficiently looked after. Now, why is this happening? Well, there's a whole array of reasons, some of which are internal to universities and some of which, of course, are external. They're about that external picture that we see in the sector at the moment around precarity, not just in terms of employment contracts, but also in terms of the financial stability of universities and so on. What we see coming out from the research overall is workload and workplace demands are one of the big factors that just recurs again and again and again. University staff having to work much longer hours, that having a negative impact on their work-life balance, and that then having an impact on their mental health and well-being overall. Part of this is explained also by what staff identify as unnecessary administrative burdens. So things that are getting in the way of them doing the stuff that's meaningful, and where there are kind of an increase in them having to perform administrative tasks that are taking up lots of time. And low levels of autonomy and control over their work. We know from lots of the workplace research generally that a sense of control over your workload, a sense of control over what you focus on, is key to mental health, and particularly key to ensuring that employees have low levels of stress. What we're seeing in the research around university mental staff wellbeing is an increasing sense of a lack of autonomy, a lack of control over work, and both in terms of the overall workload and in terms of what staff are able to focus upon. Some of this also then is driven by lack of resource. As we've seen, there have been restructures in lots of universities. Some teams have shrunk, but with the workload remaining the same, and access to resources to help managing all of that not necessarily being available. And of course, as I mentioned earlier on, for many staff, a sense of job insecurity, partly caused by ongoing restructures or by financial risk in the institution, or simply by an approach to employing staff on precarious contracts, which then increases kind of levels of stress and low levels of well-being. Some research also suggesting that in some places, and this is really varied, but in some places, poor or an absence of good management. Again, that really does vary, not just from institution, but actually within institutions. From team to team, even within the same department, you can see variations in the quality of management that some members of staff are experiencing and the impact that then has on their mental health overall. And then surrounding all of this, a sense of kind of competitive cultures, a sense where colleagues feel that they're being asked to compete with their colleagues. So that then disrupts that sense of team ethos, but also kind of extrinsic pressures to always be seen to be demonstrating their performance. I need to constantly demonstrate that they are doing useful work, or that they are achieving, or that they are meeting metrics. Many of those set externally, of course, which increases workload, increases pressure, and increases that sense of precariousness in the workplace overall. And then, the corollary to what we were talking about earlier on, a lack of time then focused on the things that might have brought people into working in universities in the first place, both for professional staff and for academic staff, that they're focusing less on the stuff that gives them real meaning and more time on those other things that they think are of less value. And unfortunately, in some of our institutions, we also have to recognize that the research also highlights bullying and discriminatory behavior or harassment is something that some of colleagues are encountering, and that then has negative impacts on their mental health and well-being as well. So a wide range of things that are really echoing across the sector, impacting on staff mental health and well-being. Now, that said, it's also really important to recognize that the research also suggests that this isn't a uniform picture. It's not that it's bad everywhere, or at the very least, it suggests that there's a spectrum of experience that staff are having that's impacting on their mental health and well-being. We're very definitely seeing in the work we're doing in the Charter that in some universities, staff are reporting that actually their role and their institution generally have a positive overall effect. It's not that things are perfect where they work, but on the balance of things, they actually feel being part of their university is a positive experience for them. Culture definitely comes out as one of the key aspects of this, what the culture of the institution is like, how it feels, how supported they feel, how connected to other people that they feel. And it's difficult to define exactly what that is, what that culture looks like, but it definitely comes over again and again and again as being really important. Certainly some of the things that we're seeing are the culture feeling supportive, leaders and the university genuinely seeming to care about their well-being, and this being demonstrated not just in things that people are saying or emails that are going out, but in the behaviours of leaders and the behaviour of the institution itself, constantly kind of reaffirming to staff that they are valued and cared for. The lesson from all of that, of course, being that poor staff well-being is not inevitable, and we should not accept it as inevitable. We should not be accepting, because of the nature of what's happening in the sector at the moment, there is nothing we can do to improve staff well-being, because the evidence would suggest that's not the case. In some institutions, it's not perfect, but it's not dreadful in the way it is in some other places. And so that doesn't provide a covering excuse for things being really poor everywhere. And we should be committed to doing everything we can to improve the well-being and mental health of our colleagues in our institutions. And that's important for a number of reasons. Now, sometimes people will raise the objection that, well, given the circumstance in the sector at the moment, isn't the reality just we have to accept this is what it's like? We're all going to have to work these longer hours. There's nothing we can do. Actually, all of that's a socially constructed reality. Those are realities that we can accept or not. We can change. We can choose to change that's the way that things are. There is another reality that's functioning here, which is that what we're talking about are human beings, our colleagues, our people. And we as people are able to do certain things and we're not able to do other things. And I particularly want to focus on research around what the human brain is capable. And we can't change the fact that all colleagues have a human brain, and human brains are capable of certain things and not capable of others. And actually, if we look at the research, we can just see that tiredness impacts brain function. There's no way around that. If you're tired, your brain function just drops. And it reduces cognitive function, it reduces your ability to process information, to learn, to create new memory, to access old memory, to concentrate and to be creative. Lots and lots of research showing that that's just a neurological response to tiredness. That's just what happens in our brain. Equally, our brain responds in particular ways to stress. Parts of our brain actually start shutting down, those kind of higher executive functioning parts of our brain, parts that we would think about in terms of creativity, learning, engaging with complex problems. Those parts of the brain actually get shut down as we become more stressed. And as a result of all of that, again, the ability to create new memories, to solve problems, to make decisions, all of that is just negatively impacted on. And then when we actually look at burnout as a separate thing, we can see that burnout very clearly reduces working memory. It reduces the ability of the hemispheres of the brain to communicate with each other. Our alertness goes down. It even starts to affect things like our visual spatial functioning. and the ability to engage in a broader context. And all of these things also impact on our ability to engage socially with other people, so to relate to other people, to have conversations, to pick up and understand the emotions that they're experiencing in that moment in time. So what we're actually saying here is that our well-being impacts on the ability of our staff to teach, to research, to think in complex ways, to learn and to problem solve. And given that the vast majority of staff in universities are engaged in thinking roles, whether that's in professional services or in academic roles, then this is a problem. If we want our staff performing to the best possible level, if we want people to feel that they're producing their best possible work, then tiredness, stress and burnout are obstacles to that happening. And that's a reality we have to actually just manage and grapple with. So what have we been seeing across universities? Well, of course, we have been seeing some universities really trying to do some work around all of this, and many universities putting at least some steps in place to recognize and try to respond to these challenges. So in most universities, we're seeing employee assistance programs. Would say, however, that in the work that we've been doing within the Charter, we are seeing that quite a number of these employee assistance programs are not really being evaluated, or if they are, they're not being evaluated well. We're certainly not seeing outcome measurement being used to demonstrate whether or not the interventions being provided are actually improving things, whether staff who access these services feel better afterwards. So there's an important corollary to saying that they exist there, is that we don't know how good they are, and we don't know, they're not really being well evaluated to tell us how good they are and whether there's things we could do to improve. We're also seeing in many universities proactive interventions being made available to staff. So these might be workshops, there might be kinds of training, there might be things like access to yoga or exercise. However, in the research, one of the other things that we're hearing very clearly from staff is we know that stuff's available, we don't have time to access it because we're so busy, we've got so much to do, that going to those things is just not possible. And so it creates a kind of cruel optimism in which theoretically there's something there that could help me, but the reality is there's no way I can possibly access it. Now, in some universities, however, there are people have taken a step further, and this is then further supported by clear and visible leadership, which is seen and recognized by colleagues at all levels who recognize that actually staff wellbeing is important, it is prioritized, and it is prioritized in some cases over workload. And there are more attitudes in terms of, well, we get done what we can get done, but actually we protect our staff within all of that because that's what makes the institution function overall. And then alongside all of that, really well done support and training for managers. And I'll talk a little bit more about an example of that in a moment that we drew on from the Charter work that we've done from the award reports that go out to universities. But in the recognition that actually managers are really important in universities for the well-being of their staff, and for providing environments and for ensuring environments in which staff can feel that they can flourish and grow and perform, and that they are, cared for and supported in the workplace. So what is needed? What do we generally need to see? What are the kind of big headlines? Well, our analysis of Charter report indicates there's a number of kind of key challenges that are facing universities at the moment that most universities could benefit from doing more on. One is about actually developing proper strategic approaches to staff wellbeing. In many cases, what we've seen are fairly ad hoc, in some cases superficial, not always, but in some cases fairly superficial responses to staff wellbeing that aren't really dealing with the direct causes. So what we actually, recommendation that goes to many universities is to actually take a more whole university approach to staff wellbeing, to really start thinking about what are the things that are impacting positively and negatively, how can we counteract the negative things or remove them, how can we enhance the positive things, and how can we do this in a much more coherent and consistent way that actually focuses on the real day-to-day experiences our staff are having, and how do we tackle those real barriers to well-being that are presenting to our staff. Workload is clearly a part of that, and there are variations to that across the sector, but we are definitely seeing, and through some of the Charter award process, we have seen some universities really starting to tackle that. Now, it's only starting to, but really being willing to, as one colleague put it to us in a university, rip the plaster off and actually start looking at the problem, and recognizing that just in doing that, that's probably going to create lots of challenges, but that until we do that, we can't actually tackle this and we can't actually do anything about it. There is obviously a need to address unhealthy culture and to establish what is healthy culture. Again, there's a challenge in this for institutions in that generally there isn't one culture within an institution. You find pockets of culture across an institution. You can have generally good culture, but then bubbles of bad culture, or a generally unhealthy culture, but bubbles of good culture. So actually it's about how do you work across the whole institution to really set and ensure there are good, healthy cultures for all colleagues across the university. And then obviously there's a need to evaluate the work that we're doing. We need to know what's working and what isn't. We need to know where to put resource and where it's not of value, because, you know, we know that in the sector at the moment, resource is not limitless. So how do we know that the work that we're doing is actually of value and is a good way to use that resource? And then finally, I need to improve communication. There's a lot of kind of research happening in the literature at the moment, and a lot of talk across universities about the fact that the ways we've attempted to communicate in the last few years probably aren't working as well. You know, the old staff email or the old student email generally doesn't work. The messages don't get through. So actually thinking about how do we ensure that really important messages actually are effectively communicated to staff, particularly around the importance of mental health and well-being. So just some examples of things that we have seen as we've been doing the Charter Awards from different universities. So we have seen an example of a really clear strategic approach, which had a robust governance structure that was connected to executive, that was actually really engaged in properly reviewing the current levels of staff well-being, being willing to face up to the challenges that was, and doing that on an ongoing basis. And then from that, producing a clear action list that everyone was signed up to, and that the university was kind of demonstrating progress against, as a way of, you know, incrementally moving and improving staff well-being overall. We've also seen another strategic whole university approach, which actually used what are called team well-being assessments, where individual teams were tasked, leaders of individual teams were tasked with identifying, you know, how is the well-being of your team at the moment? What are the risks? And then developing action plans, those team assessments, developing action plans that were actually designed, co-created with those teams to improve mental health and well-being overall. And those were then incorporated into personal development reviews. All of that supported by clear messaging from leadership. And within that institution, we heard really clear reports of how supportive and healthy the culture was. And it seemed to be across the university overall. That's not saying that there probably weren't pockets here and there that weren't great, because as I say, institutions, it's hard to get to every bit of it. But in general, it was really positive. We also saw a really interesting example of line manager development, which was really thoroughly done. So it was very carefully designed. It was designed engaging with staff and managers to understand what was needed. And then the training was delivered. It was quite a comprehensive training program, but it was also then evaluated afterwards. And so what then happened was there was a full evaluation, not just from in terms of the managers and how they felt afterwards, but actually their staff, whether their staff had noticed any difference since the managers had engaged in that training. And they were able to identify a real positive impact of the training overall. And then finally, there's a really interesting dynamic here in terms of staff social space. One of the things that we've heard a lot are that over the years, staff social spaces just kind of gradually disappeared. And that sense of shared communal space where staff can meet with each other and talk with each other informally, where they can relax, where they can connect with other people, has just gradually disappeared, which has given them a less of a sense of belonging and a sense of being seen and cared about. But what we have actually seen is in some universities, a deliberate decision to recreate staff social space, to designate space for staff, and then to invest resource in making it the best possible space it can be, to actually give staff a space that's going to be beneficial to them. And that seemed to have had a really positive effect. Staff, without us prompting them, telling us about that, telling us about what, you know, how good it was and how important it felt to having all of that. So some of this is about, you know, structural things, cultural things, managerial things. Some of it's just about very practical stuff in terms of, do staff have the space that they need? Do they feel valued? You know, what messages does all of that send out to them? Our principles of good practice then are kind of aligned with a lot of what you see in that research. So all of that being about, you know, culture and environment and being there to support good staff well-being. A culture and environment in which staff feel able to talk about their own mental health and well-being, to access support, and for that not to have a negative impact on them overall or to feel that they're jeopardizing their career if they admit that they're struggling at times. That need to feel secure and psychologically safe, to not have that sense of precariousness. Have managers who are able to support staff and manage them well and set a really healthy culture. And then to create the space for staff to adopt those healthy lifestyles. So where there are opportunities for staff to do healthy things, that they don't think, but I haven't got time. I'm not, you know, I don't have the space to do all of that. And where staff are then able to not spend their time doing lots of work that feels meaningless, but are actually able to concentrate on those things that they actually really care about and that are actually really important to them. So that's the staff well-being theme. Now, this also, of course, links into the staff development side of things. And so we need to think about, why is it that we highlight staff development in the charter? And it's because it's staff development specifically around mental health and well-being. Because again, where staff don't feel that they're able to respond effectively, where they don't feel prepared, that in itself can have a negative impact on their well-being as well as creating a risk to students. So if we're going to have a whole university response to mental health, again, we need to ensure that staff are equipped for those things that are likely to present to them. Because if staff are unable to do that, if they're unable to manage appropriate boundaries, if they're unable to respond in ways that are helpful, that can have a negative impact on staff, and it could have a negative impact on students overall. It's also true that we need to not lose sight in all of this of those staff who are mental health professionals. But there are in many universities counsellors and mental health professionals from other backgrounds who are there to work with students. That is their role. It's important too that their CPD is maintained, because otherwise they can become out of date, their skills can atrophy, and then they can be working at a deficit as well, and that can also have a negative impact on them and on students. So what do we know about this whole kind of space around staff development and what's working, what isn't, and what needs to be done? Well, one of the clear things that comes out from lots of research, some of which I was part of, is that many staff feel really unprepared and under-supported to respond to the issues that are presenting to them. And certainly in the research that I've been part of and that I've seen, some staff actually, academic staff or hall staff, having to respond to things that are really complex, really challenging, and in some cases quite distressing, and really feeling underprepared to do that. And, we need to acknowledge as universities that our staff are having to respond to those things. We can't pretend it's not happening. And so we need to make sure that when it does happen, staff are equipped, they feel prepared, and they can access support during and afterwards to make sure it doesn't have a negative impact on their well-being. We can see that many universities do provide training. It's unclear how effective that is. And it's really important to say that there's some really well-known training, badged, recognized training, where there are question marks about just how effective it is in actually changing behavior of individuals or making them feel more confident or more equipped to actually respond to the things that are presenting to them. And certainly in the research, many colleagues actually ask for training which is much more bespoke to their role, to the kind of things they're likely to encounter, so that it feels much more suited to what they do on a day-to-day basis rather than being more generic. Also really important to say that as we look at this more through the research, things that may seem quite simple on a superficial level actually get really complex really quickly. So things like maintaining boundaries might seem fairly straightforward, but actually they bleed really quickly. And many of our staff are in roles where the boundaries of the role aren't clear. I mean, students don't, in many cases, understand what the boundary of the academic role is, what they can ask for, what they shouldn't ask for, where they should go elsewhere for help. And actually, many academics are unclear about that as well. And if you're unclear about what the boundary is, it's much harder to maintain it. And that's before we even get to the fact that actually being able to maintain boundary takes a level of skill and insight as well. We also need to make sure that staff have the appropriate ability to respond to distress when it occurs, not to be able to do that in the way that the mental health professional would, but to be able to respond in ways that are safe and to signpost effectively and to do things that are helpful. And again, signposting from the research comes out as a much more complex task than we might think. It's not as simple as just saying to students, well, there is support over there, go and access it. Because actually in many cases when you do that, students don't for many reasons, or may just come back seeking more support from you because you're somebody that they know. Actually, there are layers of skill and there are layers of things that need to be built into signposting for it to be more likely that the student will go and access it and for it to be effective. So we need to think about how that then gets built into the development work that we provide. So what's needed overall? Well, within the kind of updated charter framework, we kind of have boiled down the key things that we think staff who are not in clinical mental health roles need from the kind of training and development provided to them. The first is absolutely increasing their confidence and increasing their ability to respond to any presentations of kind of distress or mental illness that they might encounter. The second is to increase the likelihood that they may recognize if something is going wrong for someone, and that isn't dependent on individuals. It's not dependent on single members of staff to get stuff right, that staff are backed up and supported by a network of support to help them make the right decisions based on what they're seeing or hearing or encountering, so that actually the right decisions are made at an earlier stage. we need to see that an open, inclusive culture, and we need development for a whole university approach to development that encourages that open, inclusive, accepting culture. That would also then benefit staff well-being, but also hopefully benefit student well-being overall. And then, as we talked about earlier, improving the understanding of boundaries and improving the ability of staff to be able to maintain safe, appropriate boundaries and to communicate those in ways which feel helpful to students, rather than feeling that they're just being brushed off. And then, as part of that, improving the effectiveness of signposting, so that actually when students perhaps approach an academic or a member of all staff or a member of security and have a conversation, that actually they are more likely then to go and access the appropriate support that's available, because the signposting work that they've received has reassured them and convinced them that it's going to be helpful and raised hope that that might actually help them. And then finally, it's also about helping staff see the ways in which actually the day-to-day functions of their role, their actual appropriate role, can be used to actually have a positive impact on student well-being as well. Because many staff really care about their students. They want to have a positive impact on mental health and well-being. And it's sometimes about helping them to see that actually maybe that's not about doing that in a way which might be, taking over a role that's better provided by student services, but instead to provide it through the things that they do. So for our academic staff, the way in which they teach and assess can have a really, influential impact on mental health and well-being, and helping them to see how that can work and how they can work with their teaching and learning approaches to positively impact on mental health and well-being. And all of that then can also be backed up by other inclusivity training, recognizing that actually, inclusivity is a big part of a whole university approach to mental health and well-being, and understanding the different needs and the diverse presentations that you might see within the university community, both staff and students, is also an important part of the way in which we respond to mental health and well-being. So what have we seen from universities overall? Well, we absolutely have seen a range of training being provided by universities to staff. It varies enormously from institution to institution. A common recommendation from assessors that we've seen is around that need for, more specific training for staff, for training around signposting, particularly for those staff who are student-facing, and then some very specific training recommendations for particularly academics who are in roles like personal tutors or personal advisors, or supervisors for PhD students, to ensure that they're able to support the students who are coming in and seeing them one-to-one. Very much the case that across the board, there was a general lack of strategic approach to staff development in many universities. Not the case everywhere, but in most of the universities that we've seen. It's very clear again from research that training in this area works much better when it's part of an overarching structure where it's bringing together networks of staff. It's not just training an individual with an individual response. It's actually part of a bigger, wider whole university response. And actually creating a strategic approach to developing all of that is really important, and something that many universities were encouraged to do more on. We're also seeing that actually many universities have created specific resources for staff, so things like flowcharts, cause for concern forms, in some cases kind of hotlines through to universities. And some of this is targeted specifically on groups like line managers or on personal tutors. And so that's really great. And some universities where staff were able to identify that as a team, they might need some bespoke training and they could request all of that, which also is really helpful because it meant that they were then getting something which was directly appropriate and relevant to the work that they were doing and to the area that they were based in. And that's really helpful, and where that's been put in place, that's been seen to be beneficial overall. And then finally, we are seeing some universities who are actually trying to understand staff development needs overall by actually using the internal data that they've got. So using things like staff surveys, or going out and actually having conversations, doing some co-creation work with staff to actually then generate the training and development that's needed overall. So just a few examples of excellent practice that we've picked up on as we were doing the charter award process overall. Some really nice instances of tailored training provided to colleagues, particularly in security and residential accommodation, where they were using real case studies from within the institution that were relevant to that team, and where they then used those case studies to work through with the team and develop skill and insight and understanding of things like boundaries and developing their confidence to be able to respond. And also the confidence to know when they had done enough, which was also a thing that came out really strongly in this particular university we talked about, where they had done some work to understand what it was that staff needed. And one of the things that came out was when do I know I've done enough? When I know that it's okay, that I've done what I needed to do and I can feel okay about it? And so that some of the training specifically then targeted that in response to that staff need. As I talked about earlier on, a strategic leadership program, which absolutely helped to create managers and leaders, and where we saw actual changes in the way managers led, managers being able to identify post the training things that they'd done differently, ways in which they'd approach problems differently, ways in which they'd work with their colleagues differently. And when staff were then surveyed, staff themselves being able to identify, yes, things are better, things have improved since that training took place. And as a result of which, staff wellbeing feeling that it had improved overall. And this was a really nice example, not just because it had a positive impact, but because it had also been fully and robustly evaluated, which was really helpful. And then we're also starting to see more coherent use of data and qualitative feedback. Universities actually really engaging with what are the experiences their staff are having, what's going on, what's having positive impact, what's having negative impact, so that actually the responses, rather than being tokenistic or superficial, are grounded in what they're actually hearing from university staff, and recognizing that, this is probably a long journey, but if we begin with the experiences staff are having and try to address that, then at least that journey is going to be going in the right direction, and we'll hopefully in time get to the right place. And again, just to recognize that the principles of good practice in this area then all speak to the kinds of things that I've just been talking about. So, we want to be seeing staff that they're developed on an individual and collective level to have that confidence and ability to respond. Staff are supported to recognize when there are risks and are able to maintain safe boundaries and signpost people across. That the training is context and role specific. That the workplace and management overall supports staff to be able to think about what's just happened, to learn from situations that they've encountered, that they've been able to consult with support when they need it, and that they're able to access development to make them feel better prepared for the next time that they encounter something similar. That managers specifically are targeted with development to make sure that the quality of management within the institution is really good, that it supports colleagues, and that it helps colleagues to develop and look after themselves. And then finally, that point that we made earlier, making sure that those staff who are in mental health roles absolutely are receiving that regular ongoing clinical development that will be crucial to them performing their role. So that's a brief introduction to the work domain overall. I hope you found that useful. And do have a look through the Library of Learning for the other resources, and we'll be adding to them as time goes on. Thank you very much for joining me through the whole of this webinar, and good luck with your work in developing your whole university approach.